So Ubisoft has not been having the best PR month, with reports surrounding Assassin's Creed going full live service, with Infinity not being received particularly well, with X Defiant, that was recently announced, this sort of mashup of Tom Clancy factions turned into a shooter, not being received well either, with reports of abuse not being completely well handled within the company, also obviously being scrutinized. And now, we're hearing that one of Ubisoft's upcoming games has been struggling, and has been struggling for a very long time. I'm referring to Skull and Bones, a game we saw announced back in 2017, but it's been years and years, and it seems like there's just no end in sight. And a report from Kotaku has detailed just how nightmarish the development of that game has been. In fact, reading through all of this, it was very reminiscent of what was reported with Anthem's troubled development, and I'd like to go through this article, present the relevant information, and just give my 2 cents on everything. The article begins pretty strongly by saying a few people said this game was cursed. Nobody knew what the fuck they were doing. You know, circumstances are pretty bad when an article reporting on it starts off like this. Skull and Bones development began back in 2013. I actually did not know this. This is 8 years ago, ladies and gentlemen. No game should be in development for 8 years. And if it is in development for 8 years, it's clearly not because of its scale of ambition, it's because it was in a whole lot of trouble. As a multiplayer expansion to Assassin's Creed IV Black Flag. Then it was meant to be a full-blown MMO spin-off to Black Flag titled Black Flag Infinite, and then it became its own separate thing, a new pirate game called Skull and Bones. And then the article details that demo from E3 2017, and then a second polished demo in 2018, though much like with Anthem and many E3 showcases, some of the developers and sources that Kotaku spoke to say that these blowouts actually were not real. They were completely fake, and the game effectively didn't exist. It was just more of a vertical slice to essentially gain some marketing traction. And then others argued that there was a version that was playable at industry events that could have launched roughly in early access state, but this wasn't meant to be an early access game, and showing a game off when it's so woefully not ready, that's just an E3 trend that needs to disappear. Now, it's been a couple years since those showcases, and apparently the game is still struggling to take shape. A former developer said a lot of stuff still doesn't make sense. Just polishing it at this point would be a waste of time. And you can especially tell how much this game has struggled given the number of times it's been delayed, a grand total of 4 times. It was originally set to launch in 2018, late 2018. It was then delayed to 2019. It was then delayed to 2020. It was then delayed to March 2022, and now it's slated for March 2023. It's had 5 freaking release windows. And even when it was slated for a 2022 launch, developers just did not believe that was possible, because that's just how far back the game was. That's how far behind the game was. Much like with Anthem, one of the most prominent issues with Skull and Bones was a lack of vision, a lack of clear creative vision. There wasn't one man at the top knowing exactly what this game is intended to be and pushing that vision forward. Too many managers vying for power, which was also what happened with Anthem. Just too many leaders, too many voices at the top trying to essentially guide the game in their own direction, and that led to the game ultimately having no direction and struggling to make definitive decisions. And the indecisiveness that all this wrought led to this game being rebooted and being refreshed a number of times throughout its development. And these reboots can just essentially shake the entire development of a game. It's upending the T-table. Even years into development, basic questions around the game's core design still haven't been nailed down. They still don't know what this game even is, really. They know it's got ships and pirates and something along those lines, but that's about the only thing that's definitive, and that's not obviously enough. You know, a ship game, a pirate ship game, could take shape in a number of different ways. It could be, combat heavy. It could be about exploration. It could be about survival. It could be about a number of things, a combination of things. And those are the things that they just haven't nailed down. They don't know what they want this game to be, other than ships and pirates. This entire endeavor has proven to be very expensive for Ubisoft, with them already having blown through the initial budget 8 years after its conception. The project has already cost Ubisoft more than $120 million, with that number continuing to balloon. And this paragraph explains that Ubisoft has this bonus system depending on how well a game that's shipped performs, but Skull and Bones is so in the hole that the project had to undergo financial write-off internally for its developers to still have a shot at any sort of payout. And one developer told Kotaku, "No one wants to admit they fucked up. It's too big to fail, just like the banks in the US. If Skull and Bones were at a competitor, it would have been killed 10 times already." Jesus. By which they mean that at any other company, they would have looked at this project and said, "We gotta cancel this before it grows too big for our own good, before we spend too much money on this. Clearly, this is going nowhere." And they would have done that at multiple stages throughout Skull and Bones' rough and rocky and incredibly troubled development. But Ubisoft leadership is stubborn about shipping this game, about putting something together, in part because it's a live service, and Ubisoft, obviously, with how heavily they're pushing for live services, with Assassin's Creed Infinity having recently been announced to take that entire series in a live service direction. They want to ship as many live services as possible. But another aspect of it is that they actually have an obligation to the Singapore government. They essentially got some money from that government, generous subsidies that would require them to hire a certain number of people at its Singapore studio, and Ubisoft Singapore must also launch original brand new IPs in the next few years. So it's almost like a contractual obligation with the government at Singapore. And for those who don't know, Skull and Bones is being developed by Ubisoft Singapore. This was the studio that was in charge of specifically the naval battle system in Black Flag, and that's why they were handed this project. But you can already see that things have not been going well for them. Lo and behold, one developer did in fact compare the troubled development of this project to BioWare's Anthem, which was marred by a lack of vision and in-office politics and just a less than ideal work environment, among many other issues. And what's really killing morale within the Skulls and Bones development team is the fact that they've been working on this same project for 8 years now, a project that seems to have no end in sight, a project that just seems to keep going around in circles, a project that people just want to move on from and pursue other creative endeavors. Incredibly desperate to ship the game and move on to something new is how Kotaku put it. And the way one former developer put it, as directly quoted by Kotaku, is that just having people working for 4 or 5 years on something that doesn't move forward, that destroys anyone. Keep in mind that in a troubled environment like this, when the project is constantly getting rebooted, a lot of work that you put into it is essentially getting thrown out, becomes useless, and you've literally wasted time and effort. And I mean, that just cannot be creatively fulfilling for anyone. It must be soul-crushing, especially when this goes on for years and years. Now, as for the current state of the game, Ubisoft actually responded to Kotaku when they were inquired about the present state of the title, and this is the response Ubisoft provided. The Skull and Bones team are proud of the work they've accomplished on the project since their last update, with production just passing alpha, and are excited to share more details when the time is right. That being said, any unfounded speculation about the game or decisions being made only works to demoralize the team, who are working very hard to develop an ambitious new franchise that lives up to the expectations of our players. No, what demoralizes a team is incompetent leadership that turns a development cycle of a game into hell, especially when they're working for a company that have enabled an abusive work environment. It's egregious how they're kind of low-key castigating Kotaku for reporting on something that is important to know about a game we've been waiting 8 years on, and to the degree where developers are speaking out because there's clearly something very wrong about the way this game's development cycle has been managed. This comes off as Ubisoft trying to make reporters feel guilty for reporting on these important issues that sources within Ubisoft itself, former employees and whatnot, have been relaying. So what Ubisoft should do really is, open up their ears and listen. But Ubisoft has a track record of not listening, of ignoring issues within the company, especially the abusive work environment stuff that's created a major scandal for them. So, screw off, Ubisoft. Over the past year, we have made significant changes to our policies and processes to create a safe and more inclusive workplace and empower our teams to create games that reflect the diversity of the world we live in. There are people who are still upset that abusers, known abusers, are still in the company. And while there are folks who have been ousted, the fact remains that Ubisoft has not done enough, and leaders like Yves Guillemot still have not taken full responsibility for essentially being complacent in all of this. Now, going back to the development of Skull and Bones, one of the issues that they ran into was the fact that it was being developed just as the next generation of consoles at the time, PlayStation 4 and Xbox One, were coming out, and so the Black Flag engine and technology got more and more dated, and so they essentially had to rework everything so that this could become a next generation title with modern graphics and gameplay design. As one former developer put it, technology was moving forward, and pretty soon you want better visuals, and then you realize that some of your assets don't fit anymore, and the more and more you start to change, the more parts become obsolete. And when a project drags for more than a couple years, your initial assumptions are no longer valid. The article then details just how often the vision surrounding the game changed during its extensive pre-production. Much like Anthem, again, at one point they had a version of the game that took place in the Caribbean, another version took place in the Indian Ocean, one version took place in a fantastical fictional world called Hyperborea, another took place in a floating base called Libertalia, a cathedral on water, and while most of these didn't make it past prototyping phase because of a lack of a solid and clear vision, this was just all a huge waste of time for the Singapore studio's developers. And even in the latter years of the game's development, the game's vision constantly changed. In 2017, when it was first showed off, it was meant to be a session-based shooter modeled after Rainbow Six Siege, but with boats, so very multiplayer heavy, very PvP heavy. But then in 2018, they added some PvE elements, a free roam mode called Hunting Grounds, similar to the Division's Dark Zones, where it would be a free-for-all for players and they could decide to cooperate or they could decide to screw each other, and along the way loot things that would allow for upgrades and enhancements. And then the following year in 2019, the core design of the game changed yet again, evolving into a survival game akin to Rust and Ark Survival Evolved, where on top of all of the naval and pirate combat stuff, you'd be managing resources, crafting, trading, but that shift proved to be too dramatic. The technology that they had established for Skull and Bones just wasn't equipped for that type of gameplay. The project's existing engine tools were ill-equipped to take players exploring on land for resources, and the additional layers of inventory were a pain to try and implement. One of the issues Anthem suffered was the fact that the Frostbite engine wasn't designed to accommodate a large open-world shooter RPG akin to Anthem. It was meant more for sort of titles like Battlefield, first-person shooters and self-contained maps, and so reworking those tools took a whole lot of time, and that got in the way of that game's development. Similar story here, where the technology wasn't set in place for a game like this to be able to be efficiently made because of a lack of foresight. Oh, but it doesn't end there. The next year in 2020, the direction of the game shifted yet again, and at this stage, developers remained unsure what shape the finished game will ultimately take. So just last year, the entire game was essentially rebooted. Just last year, developers had no idea what this game would turn out to be. The game is slated for a 2023 release window, and that still does not seem like enough time if at this stage they still have no idea what they're doing. We're essentially looking at a 3-year development cycle. I mean, they have some assets and technology in play, sure, but this game still feels like it's essentially in pre-production, and much like Anthem, it'll only come together in like the final year of its development if 2023 is the planned release window, and if the game continues to be this directionless. The way Kotaku put it is that it's not just that it isn't close to the finish line yet, it's still not even clear where the finish line is. Once again, the Kotaku article emphasizes a lack of clear direction and vision from above, too many senior leads and few willing to take responsibility for making difficult calls. Other sources feel like the project was rushed from the beginning, always settling on the quickest, short-term solution to a problem that would inevitably become a major headache later on. And then there's the lack of experience within Ubisoft Singapore proper. They developed one aspect of an Assassin's Creed game, the naval combat, but that is entirely different from making an entire game around a mechanic, around one gameplay system within a separate game. You have to create a progression system. You have to not just have a naval combat, but an entire gameplay loop that makes that naval combat shine. And also you need to have a story and narrative if you're going that direction, or if you're going pure multiplayer, that's a whole other endeavor. And so some of the developers Kotaku spoke to believe that the studio just wasn't ready for a project of this scale. Others blamed an organization within Ubisoft called Editorial. Ubisoft's Eye of Sauron-like creative division housed in its headquarters for trying to design the game by committee, so corporate interference that got in the way of developers' creativity, culture clashes within the team itself. You had different people from different development teams within Ubisoft who came together to make Skull and Bones, but they were each used to a different type of workflow or management system or work environment. It also doesn't help that there was a constant rotation of creative directors. Elizabeth Pellin is currently the creative director of Skull and Bones, but she is the third creative director. Before that was Justin Farron, who lacked a clear vision despite some good ideas. And then before that, Sebastian Puel, who had little experience in designing a multiplayer game, so why the hell was he made the creative director of a multiplayer-centric naval battle video game? Who knows? Again, just management and leadership at the top handled this game very incompetently. And with each new creative director, you would have the entire sort of development environment upended, and everything would be shaken up again, and it would feel like essentially starting from scratch. And each time they bring in a new creative director, there'd be an upheaval in the development team environment with major shakeups in leadership. Producers, game directors, and creative leads would all jump ship or be pushed overboard during these periods, a pattern of upheaval that has taken a massive toll over the life of the project. As one developer put it, every time you got feedback from Paris, they would just freak out and change everything and then change the people working on it, and that happened multiple times. And you layer that on top of the lack of a clear vision, you layer that on top of the fact that the game itself was changing constantly, and likely that's also a result of the rotation of creative directors. And I mean, it all kind of built up to really delay the pipeline of this game. They weren't just constantly changing the design of the game and the direction of the game, they were changing the team that was making the game on a constant basis, and that created further turmoil. I mean, they apparently couldn't even decide whether you want to play as a pirate or do you want to play as a boat. Do you only directly control the ship, or do you have a pirate who can go on land or on foot and manage aspects of the ship? They couldn't even decide on that. At one point it was you just played as the boat, but then at a later point you actually did play as a pirate. That meant that you had to change existing tools within the engine to accommodate for the fact that you now have land movement, land navigation, and that delayed things further. That's what a lack of vision does. It just doesn't allow the developers to focus on specific things and work on those. They kind of have to scramble and try to patch up things to accommodate for the constant shifts in direction and the various design elements that are required to be implemented for the different visions to work. It almost feels like they're working on multiple games at once that are essentially different versions of the same game that leadership can't decide on which one to really focus on. At one point, years and years into development, they were so directionless that they actually decided to bring back old design documents from 2016 because now they wanted to do that again instead of what they had now in 2018, 2019. Other elements they couldn't decide on for this game: quest structure, character progression, whether it's going to be a seamless open world or smaller instance spaces, whether this would be huge maps like Ubisoft's other games or broken up into separate instant chunks. Literally, the fundamentals couldn't even be decided on because you had different teams pitching different things, and things constantly shifted because there was no one at the top to say, this is what we're doing, we're pushing forward, and that's that. As one former developer put it, instead of adding layers of value, we kept running around in a loop. There's also the issue of too many cooks in the kitchen. In 2015, the game had roughly 100 people working on it. By 2019, closer to 400. And you get to the scale once you have a clear vision, but initially you want to have a smaller team to define what this game even is before you have a bigger team that creates that vision and brings it to life. So instead of dropping back down to a small core team when the vision wasn't clear, there were just too many cooks in the kitchen, and so hundreds were left to keep working on unclear priorities. A former developer highlighted how when a game shape pivots, the requirements, the progression, the economy, and the player motivation would also have to pivot. Yeah, if you change the direction of the game, the type of game this is, everything else surrounding it also changes. And so everything you built around this one version of the game suddenly becomes obsolete, and you have to rework it and rebalance it. Now, one issue that wasn't all that prominent within Ubisoft Singapore was crunch. The issue and the burnout and the exhaustion came more from working on the same thing for months and years on end with no light at the end of the tunnel. And quality suffers when people are trapped in that mentality of what's the point of pouring all this effort into something when it might get thrown out. next time the wind shifts. As a developer put it, you don't push quality to the sky on stuff that will just get thrown out months later. It's just hard to be motivated to do your best on something that constantly wastes your time, effort, and work. And as this slog of a process continued, you can imagine that a bunch of people decided to leave. Veterans especially decided to pursue other ventures, and so what you were left with is a team that became more and more junior. You had more younger and less experienced people being rotated in as the veterans left to pursue more fulfilling creative endeavors. It's one of the only projects I've seen, according to a source, a former developer, where as we were going, the team became more and more junior because all of the talent and all of the experience would leave constantly. Those who left Skull and Bones instead went to companies like Riot, Tencent, and Facebook because they paid much better and they were just less dysfunctional, as they put it. Lack of vision wasn't the only issue with leadership and managers. Oftentimes, senior managers would surround themselves with yes men, would refuse to listen to suggestions or concerns repeatedly raised by those on the studio floor. Those who continued to voice their dissent would eventually be disappeared, either to another team, another project, or another studio. So this was just a giant echo chamber with the added layer of leadership not having a clear vision, and that's a recipe for disaster. And this kind of toxic management and toxic culture, according to a former developer, is largely responsible for the game's myriad production issues. You've got developers who weren't driven by the joy of creating, they were simply driven by fear, and fear is one of the worst motivators. Like, it gets you to do stuff, but you won't do them efficiently, you won't do the best work because you're not happy while you're doing the thing you're supposed to do. Your mind is distracted by the fear of consequences instead of being focused and being driven by the joy of creation. And while all of the recent reports surrounding Ubisoft's abusive work environment and allegations of misconduct, assault, and bullying did lead to the removal of a few bad apples, 3 sources told Kotaku the studio still, Ubisoft Singapore specifically, but Ubisoft across the board, is still desperately in need of reform. With all said and done, the bottom line here as far as the developer side of things is concerned is that they just want to ship this game. They don't even care if it's bad. Good or bad, they just want to get this out there so they can be free of it. And if you have developers working with that mentality, let's just please get this out there, I don't care anymore, you're not going to get a good game. Quality is going to suffer. And while I hope that, they manage to pull together and find a really strong vision and pursue it and find that passion again, when development has been like this, when it's been this difficult, this nightmarish, this hellish, because this feels more like a prison than anything, that is not conducive to a work environment that's going to produce the best work. So I'm extremely concerned about how Skull and Bones will ship, if it even ships. I mean, it's apparently required to be shipped based on that deal with the Singapore government. But, if it does come out in 2023, I'll be honest, I'm going to be very worried about this title. And as much as I hope that I'm wrong, and as much as I hope that this game ultimately does come together, we have seen enough stories about how work environments like this have led to disastrous launches, have led to game quality suffering drastically, and Anthem is sort of Exhibit A, but many other AAA games like this, and live services in particular, have suffered as a result of bad leadership, bad management, lack of vision, and all of the issues highlighted in this article. Or at least that's one man's take on this whole situation, reported by Kotaku's Ethan Gatch. Let me know in the comments below what you think about the current state of Skull and Bones based on these reports. Are you worried about the game? Are you still hoping for the best? Or have you kind of ruled it out entirely? I don't know, I've just kind of forgotten about this game because it's been so long since I last heard from it, saw from it, and now hearing all of this, I'm especially concerned about the ultimate outcome, but only time will tell. Share your thoughts below, and to be further updated on all things gaming news, reviews, and discussions, stay tuned right here on Young Yeah. I'll see you guys next time. Young out.